Dave here, and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the show where I examine the Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X libraries and try to figure out just how good these titles actually were back in the day and how well they've held up into the new millennium. On today's episode, I'll be looking at an impressive showing from a somewhat surprising source, or at least it was in April of 1993 when the game was released, and that game is Cool Spot. Seeing this game in 2020, you might be wondering, what the hell am I looking at? And that would be understandable if you weren't familiar with the soda and or pop scene, depending on where you live, in the late 80s and early 90s. I'll try to summarize this briefly, and this next bit is a gross oversimplification, but in the United States, nationwide, there are two stalwart purveyors of fizzy drinks, Coke and Pepsi. Due to their large size, Coke and Pepsi not only formulated and created their own drinks, they also distributed and bottled those drinks. However, what if you were your own soda company? How would you get your product bottled and in stores? Well, in the case of 7-Up and Dr. Pepper, you'd reach agreements with Pepsi and Coke for them to bottle and distribute beverages for you. In the case of Pepsi and 7-Up, this was a mutually beneficial agreement, as while Coke had Sprite, Pepsi didn't have their own clear lemon-lime beverage, and their own attempts, such as the woeful Crystal Pepsi, were miserable failures. However, all that changed with the introduction of Sierra Mist in 1999, and by 2003, Pepsi had replaced their distribution of 7-Up with Sierra Mist, drastically reducing 7-Up's presence in the marketplace. So, if you're younger or don't live in an area where Keurig Dr. Pepper has a strong presence in the marketplace, like Chicago, it would be understandable that you wouldn't know what 7-Up is. However, before all of that, 7-Up was a somewhat popular alternative to Sprite, and even had two mascots. At first, a character named Fido Dido, who's more common in Europe, and then the star of this week's game, Spot. The 7-Up logo has traditionally had a red spot in between the 7 and the Up, and at some point, someone in marketing decided to draw some arms and legs on Spot, and we somehow ended up with a brand mascot that has managed to star in 4 video games. A puzzle game on various 8-bit consoles, a rebadged McDonald Land on the Game Boy, and then this game, Cool Spot, which was released on the Genesis, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Game Gear, Amiga, PC, and Master System. We'll be covering the Master System release and Cool Spot's sequel, Spot Goes to Hollywood, which was temporarily a Genesis exclusive before receiving ports to the Saturn and PlayStation, in future videos. But for now, we'll just be focusing on this side-scrolling platformer. Cool Spot is notable for being released by Virgin Games, which at the time was the home of David Perry and Tommy Tallarico, who would both later go on to work at Perry's studio Shiny Entertainment and release titles together into the late 90s. Cool Spot is essentially the second in a trilogy of platformers that Perry and Tallarico worked on for at Virgin, with the first being Global Gladiators, and then afterwards being followed by the revolutionary Aladdin, based on the Disney movie. So, looking back on it, I probably should have reviewed Global Gladiators first, but I think I'm going to group that with McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure instead. Anyway, enough about all that. Let's take a look at the package. And here we have Cool Spot, with Spot doing his best to live up to the cool name on the package, hanging 10 on a flamin' blazing surfboard while Flounder's green cousin cheers him on in the background. Yeah, I don't really know what's going on there. There's no green fish in the game, only yellow ones, and they want to kill you. Despite that oddity, and the weirdness with the other spots hanging out in the upper corner, this is an iconic cover. Spot looks great, he's huge, the logo's great, and the branding is kept to an absolute minimum in favor of the art. When I talk about being able to tell a game from across the room, this is one of those games. And here's what I really like about it. As I spin the box, you can see that the art continues seamlessly to the spine. Great stuff. The outer case is in great shape. I really can't see anything wrong with it, no scratches or gouges, and the hang tab is intact at the top, which I always appreciate. Likewise, the inner cover is fully intact as well, with no bleaching or water damage. At least I think no water damage. The spine has a weird indentation in the middle that I associate with that sort of thing, but I don't really understand how only that part would have gotten water on it. Moving on, as we flip over to the rear cover, the art falters a bit. I actually really like the background collage thing they've got going on, but the only problem is it makes the flavor text hard to read when placed on top. It's not unreadable, mind you, but having some sort of solid background probably would have been better. The flavor text itself is pretty run-of-the-mill, but I do have to call out one thing. On the last bullet point, it says hundreds of outrageous foes. And I guess that's true if you count all of the repeated enemies in the game as being different ones, but realistically, there's only about 30 or so. I do, however, like the 3 screenshots they chose, showing off 3 of the different styles of level in the game, and their off-kilter arrangement, and then also various clip art from the game mixed in here and there. Opening up the case, the cartridge looks good, and the manual is in near mint condition. Wow, that's 2 weeks in a row. I'm very happy about that. This is another one that I didn't realize just how nice a shape this copy was in until I pulled it off the shelf to play it. Let's face it, I'm old enough now that if I bought it any longer ago than last week, then I've probably forgotten if it was trashed or not. Always a pleasant surprise when I see that. The manual on the inside looks as good as it does on the outside. And as we'll get to later, Cool Spot is not a complicated game. In fact, it's relatively simple. So this manual is about twice as large as I would expect. They really went all out in being thorough, including towards the end a write-up of each of the 11 levels in the game and tips from the designer for each of those levels. Love to see that. I also like how interspersed in all the text from the game are conceptual drawings of Spot, and for the special items in the game, rather than getting pictures from the sprites, they used the concept drawings for them as well. Very cool stuff. Finally, if you check the front cover, it mentions that you can win cool prizes, which relates to a promotion where apparently, if you beat the game on hard mode and earn all 6 available continues, and don't use any of them, you'll get a special screen to take a picture of and mail in for a prize. Very cool, and almost makes me want to beat the game in hard just to see that screen. Alright, well that's the better than I was expecting condition Cool Spot. Let's get into the game. So you may be wondering, how the hell do you make a game about an anthropomorphic dot from a brand name logo and make it good? And that's a very fair question. The first attempt at a Spot-related game was imaginatively called Spot, and consisted of an extremely rare arcade game with supposedly less than 50 machines produced, and then ports to various home computers along with the NES and Game Boy. Spot was a puzzle game based on the mascot and took advantage of Spot's shape to create what's essentially a 4-player version of Othello. I remember hearing about the game at the time, but I don't remember if I've ever seen it other than at a display of every North American NES game ever released, and I've certainly never played it. It didn't exactly set the world on fire. 3 years later, in early 1993, Virgin Games had obtained the rights to Spot, and they chose, wisely I might add, not to do a follow-up to the original Spot game. Instead, Virgin took an existing game in their catalog, MC Kids, aka McDonald Land, for those of you in Europe, and reskinned it, turning it into Spot the Cool Adventure. Why did they do this? Well, I can only assume their license with McDonald's ran out, and since they were already working with 7-Up on the upcoming Cool Spot, why not just convert it over? Well, that's just a guess, mind you, but it makes sense. Working Spot into a platforming action title was the right thing to do, and while Spot the Cool Adventure probably isn't sitting too high on anyone's list of must-have Game Boy releases, Cool Spot reinvented the character on a large scale with an original title. Now, there's lots of licensed platformers out there on the Genesis, and I mean a lot. And Spot certainly isn't the only snack-related one, with Chester Cheetah of Cheetos getting not 1 but 2 games in 1993 that we'll look at in future episodes. And while putting a mascot or licensed character into a platformer is certainly not a slam dunk, as you still have to make a decent game, it takes a lot of thought out of trying to make a game that specifically fits the character. You don't really have to come up with an involved storyline, the game mechanics have been established for years, and the game doesn't even really have to make sense, there just has to be levels to go from point A to point B. And while multitudes of titles got away with cookie-cutter experiences from a design perspective in the 16-bit era, and attempted to sell their game simply based on its main character, to really be remembered and to stand out, the game needed to be special in some way. Whether it's a unique animation style, standout soundtrack, or smooth and responsive gameplay, if you wanted a chance at a sequel and to become a franchise, there had to be something special about your game. Cool Spot managed to hit all three of those marks with the not quite yet shiny entertainment at the helm. From a visual perspective, Cool Spot really delivers the goods and has some of the best character animation on the Genesis bar none, and certainly for early 1993. Whether Spot is walking around on the beach, jumping from balloons hanging in the air, climbing up and down dangling shoestrings, or taking out enemies with his crisp soda bubble blast, Spot always looks incredibly lifelike. The character animation is very smooth, and it feels like you're controlling a hand-drawn cartoon character throughout the various levels. Spot's always doing something as well. He's never just standing still, even if you do take a second to get your bearings. He'll either clean his sunglasses or start yo-yoing. One of my favorite animations is when you fall from a great height. Now, usually that means you've messed up somehow and you misjudged a jump, and will have to backtrack to get where you were. But the animation of Spot bouncing into the ground along with the whoa sound effect he emits before impact is usually enough to get a chuckle out of me, rather than controller throwing anger. And Spot isn't the only thing in the game that's well animated. Every enemy you face in the game has the same level of care applied to it. Worms inch up and down dock ropes, crabs scuttle to and fro on the beach, and mice look like they're pinching in the bottom of the ninth when they hurl cheese at your head. The amount of care put into all the characters in the game is unheard of for a licensed title, much less a license for a commercial product like 7-Up versus a movie or a TV show. The entire graphics engine is something special. The Genesis is pushed to its limit with a display of on-screen colors, and even with all the animation in the title, there's never any flickering or slowdown. In some levels, the background even moves while you're proceeding through the level, giving a heightened sense of action. On top of that, in some areas there are also foreground items that can obscure Spot, items, or enemies, and that provides a nice sense of 3D depth to the levels. It prompts the player into really exploring the entire level, not just the parts that they can see, as players will need every item they can find to proceed to the next level and potentially earn the right to participate in one of the 6 bonus levels. I'm not sure what it is about a game having foreground objects that I really appreciate, but something about that illusion of 3D in an otherwise flat environment still seems cool after all these years. The background music in the game is fantastic. It all sounds high quality, which is something that you don't always hear on the Genesis with its FM-based sound. Each level type has its own music that fits the level well, so progressing through the game you won't hear the same music more than twice, and never twice in a row due to how the levels are structured. Well, except for the bonus level music, but usually you don't spend nearly as much time in the bonus levels. And again, there's always a buffer of at least one regular level between bonus level appearances. In addition to the given level music, if you take too long to finish a level without finding a time extension item, as the game counts down from 30 seconds on the clock, a different bit of music will play, letting you know you're running out of time, that increases in intensity until the clock expires and you lose a life, shown dramatically by Spot smashing an alarm clock with a hammer. Tommy Tallarico, whether you love him or hate him, really has a talent for getting the most out of the Genesis sound system and composing decent music. Along with the great background music, the game's sound effects are stellar. I don't do a lot of praising for in-game sound effects if you've watched a few of these reviews for Zilog and Moto, and there's a reason for that. Most games don't put a very high value on sound effects. Usually they're just there to let the player know that they've done something or that they need to do something. And as long as that message gets across, the how doesn't tend to matter. So programmers will spend more time on graphics or music. That's not true for Cool Spot. Tommy handled the sound effects for the game as well as the music, and it's clear he put just as much effort into the samples as he did with the tunes. Explosions explode, bubbles pop, and Spot makes cute noises like the aforementioned whoa when falling, or shouting out yeah when something good happens. Good audio works to really immerse the player into a game and helps increase the fun value tremendously, which is what we see, hear here. That third thing I mentioned a few paragraphs ago about how a game needed solid gameplay to make a lasting impact, well, Cool Spot has that as well. The first thing I have to mention is my absolute favorite thing about playing Cool Spot, and that's how enemies react to being killed. They stay dead. There's no leaving a screen moving one direction and then coming back and poof, that enemy that you just killed has respawned, ready to get in another cheap hit. For almost all enemies in Cool Spot, once you take an enemy out, they stay gone, giving you one less thing to worry about as you make your way through the level hunting other spots. I really wish more games did this, or at least made enemy respawning an option that you could turn on or off in the options screen. Now, granted, I know a lot of older titles there were programming limitations which caused some of this behavior, so I understand depending on the game that this sort of thing might not be feasible. But that also makes me appreciate that this much more when it's implemented. Playing Cool Spot is a relatively simple affair as the game only utilizes two buttons on the controller, B to shoot and C to jump. The goal of each level is to walk, climb, or jump your way through the level, collecting up to 100 cool points, either by collecting single cool points or 7-up icons that are worth 7 cool points. There are a total of 100 in each level to collect, but you don't necessarily need to collect all of them. Depending on which difficulty level you're playing in, two things will occur by collecting cool points. The first is, at a certain threshold, you will be able to enable the ability to open the cage at the end of the level that is currently holding your spot buddy prisoner. Keep collecting cool points, and at the second threshold, you will enable the ability to go to a bonus level after breaking your buddy out, where you can potentially earn a continue before going on to the next level. Also, the more cool points you collect in a level, combined with the amount of time you have left on the clock, can earn you an extra life as well, along with lives that might be found in levels or awarded based on your score. With all the extra lives and continues that you can earn, the game, weighing in at only 11 levels, is totally beatable. I myself completed it without too much trouble on normal when I played it this week for the review. But that doesn't necessarily make it easy. In fact, I would describe it as fair. Spot can take a certain number of hits from enemies that is reflected on a unique meter at the top of the screen that has a picture of Spot that slowly peels off the wall further and further the more he's damaged, until he completely falls off, resulting in death. As you navigate through the levels, sometimes when you destroy enemies, a slowly rising 7-up bottle will pop up, good for restoring some of your health. This gives you another reason to clear all the enemies out in a level, and also to pay attention to what you're doing rather than go too fast, as those 7-up bottles are usually the difference between life and death in a level, and they can be easily missed if you progress too quickly. And one more great thing about the game's gameplay, you can use your cool shot through walls, which you can use to eliminate enemies before they can get to you. Cool Spot definitely rewards you for using your brain and not just relying on fast reflexes. With all the good things I've said about Cool Spot, you might think it's a near perfect release. And it is pretty good, but that's probably stretching it. Spot's left and right movement is momentum based, so the longer you move left or right, Spot will start to run. However, this momentum feels a bit sluggish to get started. Thankfully, you only rarely need to run, but if you're used to something like Sonic the Hedgehog, it takes a bit to get used to. The game doesn't have a password or battery save mechanism, so if you want to beat it, you better have 2 to 3 hours available. And there's no bosses or changes in gameplay, it's literally just do the same thing 11 times, and then the game's over. Which works against the level of immersion that the graphics and sound try to establish, and makes the game seem unsubstantial. But ultimately, these are minor gripes, with the end result being that Cool Spot is one of the best platformers on the Genesis. I could really see myself picking this game up 10 years from now and playing through it again, and because of that agelessness, I'm giving Cool Spot 4 stars. I debated back and forth as to whether to give it 3 or 4, and ultimately I settled on 4 because really, the only thing the game does wrong is leave me wanting more, and it's hard to complain too much about that, especially from a 27-year-old title. Okay, that was Cool Spot, a game that an outside observer might look at and judge as just being an interactive commercial for a soft drink and be very, very wrong. I'm not sure how many of these type of games get made these days, especially with how much is involved in making a game that will get noticed, so in some respects, Cool Spot serves as a relic of a bygone era. You certainly wouldn't be getting programmers as talented as David Perry and Tommy Tallarico to work on a 7-Up game, as they would be slaving away on some AAA title instead. So I think it's important to appreciate Cool Spot for its ridiculous but quality experience. Tune in next week when I head back to the Sega CD and play a game that is not The Adventures of Willie Beamish. In fact, it's about the exact opposite of The Adventures of Willie Beamish. Instead, it's a port of an arcade title that I've never played, and I'm not exactly sure how it's going to handle the transition to the Sega CD. It could be good, or it could be really not good. I guess we'll see. Fun fact, it does support the Mega Mouse, so that might make things interesting. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.